a very well-known professor at NYU to really understand how we build trust in this community. So what I'll do today is I'll share some results about that survey, but also explain our thinking path on how to build trust in communities. So first, if you step back, what does that matter, right? Why does trust matter? So first of all, in a very selfish way, it matters for us as a business because that's how we power BlaBlaCar, right? If we have no trust between people, as you mentioned as an introduction, it's never going to work. You're never going to step into a stranger's car and ride share for 3 or 4 hours with 2 or 3 or 4 people in a car. So it really powers our business. But more fundamentally, if you step back, trust is really this sort of invisible bond into collaboration, into human collaboration, company-to-company collaboration, into state collaboration. And if you don't have trust, if you don't build trust at any scale, you have no collaboration, and fundamentally, you don't build any economy, right? So if you think over time, we've building trust at scale to be able to create our own economy. So if you take just a moment right now, right, take a few seconds and think of people you really trust, right? You just take a few seconds and people you really trust, people that would take care of your kids, people that would drive your car, people that would have access to, I don't know, your bank account, or your iPhone, right? So if you think of that, and if you do that at scale, actually, and you ask many people, you realize 2 things. You realize that interpersonal trust is very limited in reach, right? So typically, you trust tens of people, maybe 100 people. Actually, there is a very well-known British anthropologist that's done a study like that, and that has shown that typically you don't keep more than 150 relationships in your brain, right? That's the way we structured. We cannot remember 1,000 people. We cannot trust 1,000 people. And it also takes time. So if you think of people you really trust, you've probably known these guys for a long time, right? So fundamentally, interpersonal trust is pretty limited. So I guess as human beings, the way we build trust, if we take an example of 2 neighbors, Joe and Mary, 2 neighbors, Mary just moved in the neighborhood, Joe has been here for 20 years. When they just meet for the first time, Joe is probably not going to give the house keys and the alarm code to Mary when he goes on holiday. And the way they build trust, if you think of it, the way you've built trust in any of your network is by repetition, right? So you meet someone and again, you start working together, they go barbecue together, the kids go to the same school, and over time you build that trust capital with one person. So it's a very slow process, and over time you've established trust so that 3, 4, 5 years down the road, when Joe is going to go on holiday, he's going to give the key to Mary, and Mary is going to take care of the house. Now, if you think back in history, almost like pre-civilization, the only circles we really trusted were our family, so the siblings, the parents, the kids, so we had very strong trust, and almost tribes. You think back of people living in caves, pretty small tribes, pretty small communities, pretty small villages, and trust was really limited to that, right? And as we scaled, I guess as a civilization over time, we decided, okay, that doesn't work, that doesn't scale, because there are just so many people I can trust and do business with and have a relationship with. So we created trust proxies. And what I mean by that is we created governments, right? So if you think of today, if I want to buy an apartment in Amsterdam, I'm not going to trust the seller that the electricity works, that it's compliant, that he is really the owner of the flat. I'm actually going to use a proxy, a government, to know that, okay, there are some compliances, some regulations, some paperwork, some stamps, so that I actually trust not that guy, I trust a proxy, an intermediary, that's all going to be all right. We've done things like institutions, right? So when I go to the doctor and the guy tells me, okay, you know what, in 2 weeks I'm going to open you up, I'm kind of reassured to see all these degrees on the wall. And when you go to a doctor or a dentist, you'll see every time you have all these degrees on the wall, right? That's reassuring. If he has no degree and he tells you I think I know how to do it, I've done it a few times, I have no degree, but that's going to be all right. I'm not sure you'll trust him, right? So it's pretty powerful how we've done that. And in the more recent years, or the last century in a way, we've built companies and we've built brands. And today, lots of us have an Apple computer because we trust Apple to make good products. When we buy a car, we trust some specific brands that what they tell us about the car is true, and the performance of the car is right, and the CO2 emission of the car is correct. And when they screw up, they destroy their brand, as one brand has done recently. So trust is very much done by proxies, right, by these intermediaries. So in a way, over time, we went through a one-on-one model, like people living in villages or in a cave, to a one-to-many model, where we have these intermediaries, these brokers of trust that enable us to transact, to do business, to do all kind of things. Now, what's really fundamental, and that's, to me, it's something that's been happening for the last few years, really, obviously through the internet, but also through all the sharing economy platforms, like BlaBlaCar, like Airbnb, like many others, is the way you build trust is very different now, because you can actually capitalize your trust, right? You can create some trust capital over time. So if you use BlaBlaCar, for example, let's take Joe again as an example, and if he's using BlaBlaCar as a driver over time, and he collects like peer reviews from many people over time, he's actually building that trust capital over time. And when you have like a new person actually that wants to interact with Joe, whether it's to do a ride share or even something else, suddenly you can almost download that trust capital, because you know that Joe has been rated by another 20 people, he's a good driver, he's a nice guy, we checked his ID, we checked his bank account, we checked his mobile phone, and suddenly you have access to all that trust capital, and you're going to be willing to transact with Joe, whereas if you knew nothing about Joe, maybe you would not do it, right? So it's fundamentally changing the way we interact, and we see that now at very massive scale with the like of Airbnb, BlaBlaCar, Snapcar, and many other platforms. To the point where, in a way, we're disrupting really interpersonal trust without intermediary, both in reach, because suddenly I have access to all of you guys if you're on one of these platforms, and in time, because suddenly I don't need to spend a lot of time with you to actually know a lot about you and trust or not trust you based on the information I have. So it's a pretty fundamental disruption that's linked to the sharing economy, and that's really happening right now, and that really happened in the last few years. So in a way, we went from that model of interpersonal trust, of you knowing like maybe 50, 100, 200 people, to what we call a trust grid, where suddenly you have access to all these user profiles and you can start trusting people very far from your own network very quickly. So, and if you think of the today's model, essentially we go from a one-to-many to a many-to-many interaction. And if I map that in time, just kind of summarizing what I just described, so we went from this one-to-one model, where essentially you can only interact with people you know and you've been knowing for a long time, to using brokers, through intermediaries, and we've been doing that for like a century or so, to suddenly we reinvent a lot of businesses where suddenly you don't need actually a hotel to find a room in San Francisco. You don't need actually like a bus or a train company to go from A to B. Actually, you can interact directly with another human being and do commerce directly. And if you wonder, is it really disruptive? Is it really fundamental? Think of like all the regulation fights and all the regulation issues actually that we see around the sharing economy. And actually, it's just because who's being disrupted? To some extent, it's traditional companies, but also governments, right? It's the role of the governments and institutions to some extent that's being challenged by the fact that people can now bypass some of these institutions or governments to interact directly and transact directly. So, to some extent, it's a bit like, when we invented the phone, we started to communicate freely between people, and we've built the internet on that. Today, as we build trust between people, we can really unleash trust at a massive scale. So let's talk about like how we unleash and talk about the sharing economy and talk about BlaBlaCar for a minute. How do we unleash that sharing potential? So for those who don't know BlaBlaCar, it's a very simple idea at the end of the day. Most things that work at scale tend to be very simple at heart, very hard to execute. It's long-distance ride sharing. So essentially, we allow drivers to share their ride when they drive between cities. So if you're driving from Amsterdam to Brussels on Friday and you have an empty car, we allow you to actually sell those seats to 2 or 3 passengers going the same way and share your cost. Very basic concept. Obviously, the challenge at the beginning, when we first presented the idea, it was in 2007, people said, that's crazy. People are not going to do that because they're not ever going to trust each other, right? So it's never going to work. And if you get 100,000 people to use BlaBlaCar, it's a miracle, guys. So get a real job. We did not. Um, so if you think of how it works, right, one part of BlaBlaCar is very classic, right? It's something you would expect. It's a search engine. It's a scheduler where you say, I want to go from here, London to Montreal, actually sell those seats to 2 or 3 passengers going the same way and share your cost. Very basic concept. Obviously, the challenge at the beginning, when we first presented the idea, it was in 2007, people said, that's crazy. People are not going to do that because they're not ever going to trust each other, right? So it's never going to work. And if you get 100,000 people to use BlaBlaCar, it's a miracle, guys. So get a real job. We did not. So if you think of how it works, right, one part of BlaBlaCar is very classic, right? It's something you would expect. It's a search engine. It's a scheduler where you say, I want to go from here, London to Manchester. But then what you see, you don't see cars. We don't even show cars, actually, in the search engine. We show people. We show these trust profiles. And suddenly you have access to that trust capital I was talking about, where you can see Joe and Mary, and you can actually check their profile, check the verifications we've done on them, check what the community has been saying about them. And that's how you pick your driver. And reversely, that's how the driver is going to accept or refuse passengers. So why does it matter? I guess 8, 9 years ago, when people thought if we get 100,000 people using it, it would be a miracle, it did not matter. Today it matters because we're doing that at a pretty massive scale. It's global. We're talking about 30 million people actually using BlaBlaCar on a global scale today. We're talking about a massive impact on the environment, a massive positive impact on the environment. And we're talking about a transport network that's 5 times bigger than the Eurostar, right? And that's growing a lot faster. So how did we do that over time? How did we build trust over time? Because there is a bit of a chicken and the egg problem when you start something like BlaBlaCar, which we talked a bit on Snapcar about creating liquidity and creating trust. So we defined a framework we call DREAMS, which is how we go about over time collecting user information to create that 100% trusted profile. So we call that DREAMS, and it's about a few things. It's about declaring information. So in a way that it starts by you, the users, actually giving us some information, giving us your photo, or your biography and what you've been doing, and saying a few words about yourself, which is pretty critical. That's the starting point of the human side of the service. Then what's really powerful is people rate each other, so we collect peer reviews. So today we have tens of millions of peer reviews in the community. So we probably get to hundreds of millions of peer reviews by the end of the year, which is a massive trust capital we're building in the background. You have this notion of engagement in the sense that you're going to pay. So you're going to pay online, you're going to give your credit card, someone is going to give a bank account, so you have the transaction is actually formalized. You have a notion of activity, so we show you how many times the user has been using the activity, when was the last time the user has used the activity. We have what we call moderation, which is very much about verifications. So over time we actually verify the phone number of the person, we verify the bank account. In some countries we actually verify even the ID in India, for example, of the drivers and passengers. And then social, so we plug into existing networks that you all know, LinkedIn, Facebook, VK in Russia, and so on and so on. So as we do that, clearly we start really unleashing trust at a very high level. So what I'm going to show you now are some of the results on how do we build trust and how do we measure that, right? Is it all some kind of bullshit that we do all of that and it doesn't really work, or how do people measure those level of trust? So you can see we've done that in 11 countries. So it's a very global study that again we've done with NYU. And we've done that on roughly almost 20,000 people, right? So it's very statistically relevant, a full respondent, right? We emailed almost hundreds of thousands of people. And first, to understand that, what we needed was a benchmark. So we needed to sort of benchmark trust, to have some kind of comparable between a trust profile on BlaBlaCar and how people define trust. So we asked people, okay, on a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being no trust, 5 being full trust, how do you trust your family, your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors, and people in your social media? So, and what I'm showing here is how many people actually responded 4 or 5. So 4 or 5 being the highest level of trust. So no surprise, you trust your family, you trust your friends almost as much as your family. In some groups you find that reverse, which is quite funny. your colleagues and your neighbors and your people in your social network. And then we ask them, okay, how much do you trust like a full profile, like this dreams profile on BlaBlaCar, right? So how much would you trust that on a scale from 1 to 5? It's the same in the same survey. And what's staggering is the level of trust you can build from people you've actually never met, right? So people declare, like we had like 88% of people saying it's a 4 to 5 if I have all the information, if I have all the checks, the peer reviews, the photo of the car, the model of the car. If I have all of that, I trust that more than the colleagues, almost as much as my friends. So that's pretty powerful, right? So it really quantifies how you power trust in these communities. So then we ask ourselves a question, which was, what's the effect of brand, right? Because if you remember the first part of the presentation, the way we've built trust was through companies and brands. So at some point, BlaBlaCar becoming, in some countries, a very big brand, a pretty well-known service, a pretty big company, you get to wonder, okay, do they trust us? Because it's BlaBlaCar and they've seen that on TV and they've been using it and their friends have been using it, or do they actually really trust the user profile? So we asked another question, which was like, okay, if you had all that information on a generic platform, how much would you trust that user? And you see it's a bit different, but still, you generate like a very high level of trust, which is not as high as the branded trust, but you can see that user profile, that dreams profile is pretty powerful independently of any branded platform. So that's kind of a summary of it, right? So you realize that you have two aspects as you build trust in a community. One is really like purely about the information you gather on your dreams profile and the user profile you created. And the other one that we cannot completely neglect or decorrelate from it is the effect of the brand, right? So there is, over time, you build an effect of brand with BlaBlaCar, with Uber, with Airbnb, with all these services. That's pretty significant. So then we wondered, like, okay, how do we spread trust? Once we created those like 30 million, maybe one day 100 million users actually on which we gather trusted information, how do we spread that and how does it spread? So the first thing that was pretty staggering is 48%, almost half of the respondents said they're more open to others, having used BlaBlaCar, right? Because suddenly they realize that, hey, it works, trust is being built, I'm actually more open to interact with other people than ever before. And then we asked them, like, how likely are you to use another service in the sharing economy, right? So I've thrown like a few names here, but we categorize that into peer-to-peer car rental, crowdfunding, co-working, peer-to-peer housing, skill sharing, and buying and selling stuff online. And what you can see here is like before, so it's people that did not yet use BlaBlaCar, did not yet use ride sharing, and what was the level of response. And you can see the millennials, the 18 to 25, and as dark gray, and the rest of the population as light gray. And then we asked the question, okay, now since you've been ride sharing, how likely are you, or did you use other services? And it's really interesting because you can see that things that people were doing before, like buying and selling stuff online on classified, you have an uplift, but in a way they were doing that before. But if you look at the long tail, if you look at like peer-to-peer car rental, which was the presentation just before, actually our users are like 3 times more likely to do Snapcar after having using BlaBlaCar than before, right? So it's pretty powerful because you realize that building that trust, building that trust capital over time actually enables those communities to actually use other services over time. So essentially we realize over time that you're 3 times more likely to engage in another sharing economy services if you already used BlaBlaCar. So once trust is unleashed, I won't go through that because I'm going to be running out of time, but you realize how fundamental that trust capital can become. And if we just walk back like 5 years ago, there was nothing like that. And sometimes we tend to forget like the speed of evolution or the speed of change. Today we're talking about communities of like tens and tens of millions of people. I think in 5 years, we'll realize that we have communities like that of like hundreds of millions of people sharing and actually transacting directly. So if you think of the level of disruption we'll see in the transport industry, in the accommodation industry, probably in the education industry, which maybe not an industry, but education overall, I think it's going to be pretty massive in the next 5-10 years. So I'll just finish with a visual representation of like how do you unleash trust, talking about BlaBlaCar. And I'll show like a quick video where what we've done is we've done like this real, almost like real-time analysis of where people travel over time. So you'll see the pretty cool video, pretty cool data video, where we start from Moscow and then zoom out on Europe, and you see like all these users actually sharing rides on BlaBlaCar. So I'm just gonna, I think I cannot launch the video, so boom. So, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. I hope my, yeah, thank you so much. Maybe a last question. If you would give the good people in the audience an advice to start a new sharing economy startup, what industry do you think you should go in now? Like, what would you do?
So I think where I would probably not go is what's already being done, right? So accommodation, transportation. So if you think, I mean, the way I always think of that is, where do you spend the most money, right? So you spend a lot of money on your accommodation, so hence it makes sense to save money.
No? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Maybe we can do some Q&A. Really real quick Q&A. We got some minutes, and I see some hands, so. We don't have a mic. The mic is coming. These two gentlemen here in front and there. Yeah, these three. Maybe now it's working. No. It's also technology to disrupt. Okay, what's your question? How do you generate demand? Yeah. How did you generate demand? Is your mic? Is everybody's going to talk in my mic? That's weird. Yeah, I think it's on. Put the mic on.
His mic.
Go for it. Yes, just try testing. Or I'm going to repeat.
Maybe you
yeah,
can answer the question, right? No, it's a long, okay, here we go. So, good, technology. So how do we generate demand? It's, the fact that we have a true C2C marketplace, right, where we essentially the same people are drivers and passengers. So it's not like we hire professionals to be drivers, building supply, and then you have people actually booking rides, which is like what most taxi hailing companies would do. The reality is, we don't go about like generating demand or generating supply. We need to generate both at the same time. So building the C2C marketplace is very much like a small step increment where you need to actually simplify the problem. And for us, simplifying the problem means when we start a country, we think, okay, what is the most likely route people are going to be traveling on? And let's try to build a bit of supply, a bit of demand on that specific route. And then over time, we build more and more routes. And that's how we've built this transport network you've seen here.
Yeah, we've seen that with TaskRabbit, like they focus on the most popular services,
Yep.
and you on the routes.
Make it simple.
Two more, really quickly.
Yeah, it's working.
Yay!
With your questionnaire about trust, you asked people, do you trust the BlaBlaCar driver? Of course, people know that when you asked, do you trust him, you really ask him, do you trust him to be a decent driver? Whereas with your family, what's trust? Trust is such
What's
a big
your
thing.
question?
So how did you manage to compare those questions and those answers, asking what trust is?
So the way the question was framed was actually not like, do you trust that person as a driver? Because it was not just one way, right? So it's a community of drivers and passengers. So it would be, do you trust as a driver or as a passenger? But we didn't ask the question this way, right? So you're right, there is always a bit of a bias. Because people probably think, okay, it's a question about BlaBlaCar, so I'm going to answer in a BlaBlaCar sense. But essentially, it's just to see evolution, right? So all this data is at the end pretty imperfect, but it's very interesting to see effect of brand, to see where colleagues and even social media contact end up on that trust ladder, and how much, even if it's just about being a driver, it's still someone you're going to spend like 3 or 4 hours with. So it goes beyond that, right? So if you think of fundamentally, when you ask that question, you're not really asking like, do you trust that he's a good driver? That's way beyond that. That's way beyond that, because you spend 4 hours with that person in a car, you're going to be talking, there are safety questions. So I think it's a lot more fundamental than a driver or a passenger, right?
Okay. Last question.
First of all, congrats for your presentation. It was really exciting. I'm Christos Stamatis. I'm from Greece. I'm founder of startup in sharing economy, Mermix, and it's, let's say, Airbnb, but for agricultural tools. We help farmers to share their agricultural tools.
Cool.
So what's your opinion about sharing economy and agricultural sector? Do you think it's something that can...
So about
You
the
ever thought about
works?
it?
The agriculture sector, I guess I have no opinion. I don't know anything about that, right? So look, I think if you go back to the presentation, I think many industries can be disrupted, and not so much by this notion of sharing economy, which I think this buzzword has been misused. I think this notion of like trust age and trust metrics that we create over time and that's being created over time is actually a lot more fundamental, because it's going to change the way people do commerce in a massive way. Not just sharing economy, just commerce overall. And in your industry, it's probably highly relevant that these businesses or these farmers or whoever is going to use that, you're going to need to build enough trust so that they can transact directly, right? Or share tools more directly. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Are you going to stick around a bit?
All afternoon, yeah.
Well, have a great
Thanks.
time.
Thank
And thank you again. Applause.